And welcome everybody. It's just 12 o'clock here on a rather chilly winter day here in Minnesota, fitting for the first of our winter series of webinars. We have a fantastic series coming up this winter, so if you haven't seen those, visit us on our website at mndnr.gov/discover, and you can register for all our winter series there. So a lot of fun stuff coming up. And today we have a fantastic topic. I just love flying squirrels. They're cute and they're funny and they're all kinds of fun. So Michael Joyce is joining us today to talk about some research that's going on with he works for the Natural Resources Research Institute up at the University of Minnesota in Duluth and talk about flying squirrels. So Michael, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks everyone for joining. Like Benji said, I'm going to be talking about flying squirrels in a changing world, some research we've been working on. But where I'm going to start, just make sure this is advancing. There we go. What I'm going to do for part one is we're going to talk about just some basic flying squirrel information, biology, ecology, learn a little bit more about them. And then part two, we'll talk about some ongoing research and why we're interested in them, what we're doing and what we're hoping to learn, and some preliminary results. So I'd like to start just with this meet the flying squirrel. A lot of people have heard of flying squirrels, know what they are, but whenever I do events like this or chat with folks, there's a number of people that are surprised to learn that we actually have flying squirrels in Minnesota. And one of the reasons for that is because they are nocturnal, they can be kind of secretive, and so you might not see them even if they've been living amongst you and near you for years. People who have seen them, typically people who see them while they're out in the woods incidentally, or unfortunately, sometimes they can be a little bit of a pest getting into people's houses, and that's where a lot of people have seen them as well. So this is a flying squirrel. This is one of our species in Minnesota here. Many of you, or any of you that remember Rocky and Bullwinkle, Rocky J. Squirrel is also supposed to be a flying squirrel, and we'll come back to that in a little bit and see if the sort of picture here matches what we would expect for a flying squirrel. So one thing I want to start with, a really important misnomer, and it's right there in the name, flying squirrels, they don't actually fly, they glide. And so when we talk about flight, we mean self-propelled flight. So what birds and bats do, and that's not what flying squirrels do, they glide. So they have this big membrane. We'll talk a little bit more about the adaptations they have that allow them to glide and why they glide, but that's where I wanted to start. And they are not the only mammal around the world that has evolved to glide. There's many other species that have evolved separately to be able to glide. So one is this colugos, flying lemurs. They don't fly, and depending on what taxonomy they are not lemurs, but they are primates. There's other rodents that are not in the squirrel group. So this scaly-tailed flying squirrel, it is a rodent, but it's not actually a squirrel. They live in Africa. And then a number of other marsupials. So feather-tailed gliders are the smallest gliding mammals, and sugar gliders or mahogany gliders, if anyone's familiar, they have been available as pets in some situations. And so they have a lot of adaptations, and we'll talk about them in a little bit for flying squirrels, but they share a lot of things. And you can see in this case with this scaly-tailed flying squirrel in the middle, it has these membranes between its limbs that it helps it glide when it's jumping into the air. So this is evolved separately in flying squirrels from all of those other groups. Why would mammals that weren't gliding evolve to glide? And there's really two main explanations that have been proposed. One is energy efficiency and foraging. And so if you're crawling up and down trees across the forest floor, you might be more exposed to risk and you might be a little slower. Whereas if you can jump and glide at top speed at a lot faster than you can run around, you can explore a greater area, have better access to the food that's available, and just cover a lot more ground. So that's one proposed reason. The other is predator avoidance. And so if you're on a tree and you're a small mammal, like many of the gliding mammals are, and a predator is coming up the tree, if you can jump and get away and glide and safely land somewhere else, that might be a way for you to get away when you encounter predators. Obviously, these two explanations don't have to be one or the other. It could be kind of both. Just a little bit of where flying squirrels fit in with other mammals. They are rodents. And so this just shows some different types of rodents. You can see squirrels right here. So flying squirrels are true squirrels, and that's the group that they fit in. So they're rodents. A lot of people realize that, not everyone does. And within flying squirrels, it's a pretty diverse group. So there are about 14, 15 genre, about 45 to 50 species worldwide. So if you can see my cursor, glaucomes, that's our flying squirrels in North America, but they're distributed across Europe and Asia, and there's a lot of different species. So one that I always like to talk about or show is this giant flying squirrel. I don't remember exactly what flying squirrel species this is. Giant flying squirrel. There's several giant flying squirrels, but it lives in Southeast Asia. It's a really big flying squirrel. They can be about 1.5 to 3 kilograms. So about up to like 7 pounds. They're 1 to 2 feet. So they're really big. It'd be something to be walking through the woods and have one of these come gliding by. Here in North America, we have 3 species, and we used to just have 2 species until some research in about 10 years ago found that no, there is actually a 3rd species. And so here in Minnesota, we're at the area where 2 species meet. So we have the northern flying squirrel, which goes north of here up throughout Canada, kind of comes down in the Rocky Mountains, but goes all the way up to Alaska. The southern flying squirrel is the other species we have here in dark gray on this map, and they go down into Central America and through the eastern part of the United States down to Florida and Alabama and Mississippi and the coast there. The new species, the Humboldt flying squirrel, used to be considered a northern flying squirrel, but that again recently that's been shown to be different. And one thing that's really important here is that these evolved from a single common ancestor, and the reason that they became different species is because they were isolated for many years when the continent was covered with glaciers. And so that'll become important a little bit later, but I just wanted to plant that seed right now. One of the questions I get a lot is, here's a picture I took of a flying squirrel outside my house. Is it a northern flying squirrel or a southern flying squirrel? And it can be really, really difficult to tell with any confidence. And so this image here, what you can see is that northern flying squirrels are bigger. There are some differences in coloration on the tail that can help. Southerns are smaller. But with just an image, it can be really hard to know where they lie. One of the characteristics we use when we're handling flying squirrels for research is we look at the fur on their belly. And so northern flying squirrels on the left here, if you sort of separate their fur on their belly, it's gray at the base, white at the tips. And when you look at southern flying squirrels, it's white from the base all the way up to the tip. And so it can be kind of hard. You can see in this image here, it looks a little gray. That's just the skin coming through. So that's one way to tell. But as you can imagine, if you happen to see one, you're not going to get a look at its belly. So that can be difficult. One thing that some researchers have done more recently is look at whether it would be possible to identify flying squirrels to species where both exist by camera. And so if you have a good image that shows either a lateral or a dorsal view here, so from the side or from the back, and you have an object of known size, you can actually take measurements from the image that can help you figure out whether it's a northern or a southern. The problem is there is a size that overlap that could be either, but if it's small enough and you're not in the time of the year where you could have young, you can know that for sure it's a southern. If it's big enough, you can know for sure it's a northern, but there is a range where it could be either. So I already mentioned they don't fly, they glide, and they share a lot of morphological adaptations, so adaptations in their body size and shape that allow them to glide through the air. And they share this with a lot of other flying squirrels, but also other species of gliding mammal. So some of the adaptations they have, and not just for gliding, but for how they make a living, they're strictly nocturnal. So they have these large, dark looking eyes that helps them really get whatever light is available and helps them more effectively see while they're out at night. Same as like our deer mice, they have very similar appearing eyes. They have this this thin flap of skin that they can stretch between their forelimbs, their wrists, and their ankles. And so they basically can extend their legs and arms into sort of an X shape. And then they have this membrane. It's called a patagium or patagium. I've heard it both ways. So that's really important. That allows them to glide. They also have this flattened tail that's relatively long for their size, and that helps them steer. It can work as a rudder. It also helps them balance in the air as they're gliding. And then as they're coming into land, they can put that up like an air brake, like you might see on a plane, to help slow them down so that when they're landing, they don't hurt themselves. And then finally, they have this thing called styloform cartilage. It's a projection of cartilage that comes out of their wrist, and it attaches to their patagium, and it allows them again to have increased stability and maneuverability and really stretch and move that membrane. So you can think of like vertical wingtips on an airplane. It helps them sort of have that stabilizing force as they're gliding through the air. This is just an image showing the progression as this particular squirrel was coming into land. And what you can see is they're using some of these adaptations we talk about. So here, while they're gliding, their arms are stretched, that membrane is taut. And as they're coming in to slow down, the tail sort of goes up a little bit to create wind resistance. They pull their arms and their hands and feet together so that there become, some ballooning that you can have here, and then they're landing. So you can see some of those adaptations in action in this sequence, which is a pretty cool sequence that this paper reported. Okay, so I don't mean to cause controversy, but any of you that are familiar with Rocky and Bullwinkle, Rocky's supposed to be a flying squirrel. But is Rocky really a flying squirrel? What about the adaptations we just talked about? How many of those actually match here? So first of all, big eyes, but most of them are not pupil here. And so these eyes look like they were made for daytime. So that doesn't seem to match. There's no patagium here. So that doesn't seem to match. Hard to tell if this is just a really flat tail, but to me, it looks bushy, more like a gray squirrel tail. So that doesn't seem to match. And I'm not seeing any styloform cartilage coming off the wrist. And again, not trying to cause controversy, but the conclusion that I would come to is that Rocky appears to be a gray squirrel with a pilot's license. Again, obviously I'm joking, but it is interesting to see what are the adaptations that a flying squirrel has and how does that match this character. Okay, so what do they eat? We'll just go through a few aspects of their general ecology now. They eat a lot of different things like most small mammals, and what they eat can vary based on whether it's a northern or southern flying squirrel. It can also vary just based on season or where they live and what's available. But both species eat a variety of different things, including fungi. And so you can see some pictures down here of some fungal spores. They're actually really important for dispersing mycorrhizal fungi in our forest ecosystems. That's because they eat, and then when they go and defecate, they move the spores somewhere else. They eat tree sap, lichen, fruit, berries, nuts, not just acorns, but nuts, seeds, other parts of plants. I have a cricket here, but insects and other invertebrates. They pretty much will eat whatever they can get their tiny little hands on and whatever tastes good to them. They also, one important thing is that a lot of these foods are less available in the winter. And so they do cache food, whether they're acorns or mushrooms or other things. They do stockpile them in the fall so that they have a readily available food source that they can use to help get through the cold months of the winter. Well, they're a small mammal, and so not only are they consumers in our forests, but they're also prey to other predators. And so there's a range of different things that can and do eat our flying squirrels, a variety of different mammalian carnivores like fishers, martens, foxes, bobcats, coyotes, feral cats, non-feral cats that people let outside. So just a good reminder not to let your cat outside unless it's on a leash or somehow is not going to be able to get some of our native animals when it's hunting. And then raptors, most of the raptors that eat them are owls because of their activity pattern, but occasionally they'll be out sort of dawn and dusk, or they'll move during the day, rarely. And if they encounter a hawk, they could be taken and eaten by a hawk as well. So this is just important because not only do they function as consumers that eat seeds and disperse, in some cases, seeds and fungal spores, but they're also a critical prey. So they're really important to a lot of other organisms that live in our forests. To drive the point home, I'm going to show you a series of videos now from our research. You're not going to hear anything. There's nothing other than people being surprised. So this was a flying squirrel that we released here in Duluth after collaring it. We didn't know, but danger was lurking. And so we're going to look at the video on the left first. What you're going to see is this flying squirrel going up the tree. And then, sorry, that went right into that. That wasn't supposed to. I'm going to play the one on the left again, just so you can see again. We released this flying squirrel. It's running up the tree. What we didn't know is that there was a barred owl that was keyed into what we were doing in the area and waiting for an opportunity. And so the second video, which I'll again show a few times, is going to show a barred owl swooping in and trying but failing to kill this squirrel. Okay, so it's gonna, we'll start it over here. So you can see, so that's the same tree. The barred owl flew in. Fortunately, the flying squirrel was paying attention and was able to move to the other side of the tree. So I'll play that one more time in case anyone missed it. So other than flying squirrels, I also study carnivores, and so I'm usually on team predator. In this case, with our study animal, I was really happy that it was able to get away. Barred owls need to eat too, but we had to shut down this entire trap line for at least a few days because the barred owl, learning that the traps meant there might be flying squirrels, sort of sat on that site for a few days. So we waited until it was gone for a few days before we resumed our activities. The last thing in the sort of general section I want to talk about is just this has gotten a lot of press, and a lot of people are aware and like to talk about it, but for reasons that are not fully understood, flying squirrels glow pink under UV light. And so here's one of our flying squirrels we've captured. You can see it's in a Ziploc bag. I want to make the point now that this bag is not sealed. This is how we handle them so we can observe them without actually physically holding them. And this is just a part of our process. And so this squirrel is alive. It's not sealed in the bag. It can breathe. It spends about a minute or two in the bag before we let it go. But what you can see is this really cool, almost bubblegum pink color. Nobody really knows why they glow pink. There's a few different hypotheses. One is that this coloration, there's more UV light out at night, and so this coloration may help either camouflage them or make it harder for predators to see them. The other thought that has been proposed is that this is just waste product, kind of like you can think of it as sweat, coming out of the squirrels, and it doesn't actually serve any function. Squirrels that are active, other tree squirrels active during the day, don't really fluoresce. It's kind of a cool phenomenon. If anyone has seen this in person, it's really, really cool to see. And it's got a really cool story too. So a professor at Northland College was out with the UV light, I think looking at lichens and shining it around, and a flying squirrel just happened to glide over, noticed that it was pink. And that observation was enough to sort of spark the interest that led a small team to digging into this further. And so in terms of like science as a process, I think it's a really cool story where there was just this chance observation, and that we still don't really understand fully what's going on with this. So wanted to definitely talk about that. Okay, so now we're going to move to the second part, which will take up the rest. And it's going to be on flying squirrels in a changing world and the research and why we're interested in them in my lab here at NRI. Starting a little more general, what we know, and we've known for several decades now, is that with climate change, we're seeing this rearranging of where different species live. So it's causing these geographic range shifts in a lot of different animals. So in general, with climate change, animals are moving to higher latitudes, so farther north, and or to higher elevations, depending on where they live. And so this can be problematic, partly because the northern species might run out of room, but also because these can create new interactions between species. And so I'll try to, throughout the talk, hopefully I won't use too much scientific jargon, but when we think about sympatry or sympatric species, those are species that live together and can interact at one place at the same time. Allopatry or allopatric species are those that do not overlap. And so one of the things we're seeing with climate change is that species that formerly did not overlap are now starting to overlap. And flying squirrels are one example that I'll go into in the next slide. One of the issues with this is that this can, if they're closely related species, this can lead to conservation and population issues as they compete for resources that they both like, that where they didn't used to have to compete. And it can also cause issues with like diseases and novel diseases, which we'll talk about a little bit right at the end. And so when we have this new interactions, this new overlap, there's a few different ways it can go. It can result sometimes in just coexistence in a different community. It can lead to what we call spatial or temporal partitioning, fancy words just to say they maybe avoid each other, and even though they're in the same landscape, they don't live in the same place. Or if they do live in the same landscape, they might just use resources at different times. I always think of my kids who are wonderful, but sometimes love to fight with each other over toys. Spatial partitioning would be if one of my kids took a toy and went to her room, shut the door so no one else could get in, and then she'd have exclusive access to that toy. Temporal partitioning would be if they would share, as we're always trying to get them to do, so that one of them has it and then gives it to the other one. The last option, which is the one that we're really concerned about from a conservation standpoint, is what we call competitive exclusion, which means that one species completely outcompetes the other and pushes it out of an area that it formerly lived. So this is more general, even though you see there's some pictures of flying squirrels on this, but this is a big concern with our flying squirrels in Eastern North America, really across this area where we have northern and southern flying squirrels overlapping. So as I mentioned earlier, they split off into different species when they were isolated by glaciers. So these contacts between them are really new from an evolutionary standpoint. And so these are first contacts that they're making as southerns are able to move farther north. And in some places, they are excluding and pushing northerns farther north in the process. So what we know is we have an area, typically deciduous forest, that southerns do well, but they're expanding north into this sort of mixed zone. Northern flying squirrels do well in deciduous, but really do better than southerns in coniferous forest. And then in this zone of sympatry, there's a few things that are going on that are of concern. Hybridization, the two species can interbreed. We don't yet know if that's happening in Minnesota, or if it is, what the consequence of that is. There's been some concern that southerns are bringing a parasite that northerns aren't as well adapted to, and that's helping push northerns north. So that's what we call parasite mediated competition, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then, like I mentioned earlier, we could also just have this resource competition. And so the way this can go is southerns move north, and then they push northerns farther north. And some of the observations over the last 20, 30 years are of southerns moving hundreds of kilometers in some cases north as climate has changed, and then pushing northerns out at the same time. And this is just an example from coastal Maine. So time is on this horizontal x-axis. And so when they started this work in the 80s, the green line is acorn production, just ignore that for now. But what you can see is when they started this in the early to mid 80s at this site, they were really only capturing northern flying squirrels in the blue line. But as things went on, they had this crash, and eventually they were totally replaced by southern flying squirrels. And it's not just in coastal Maine. There's a lot of areas in the eastern US where this has been documented. To the point that in some places there are special conservation protections for flying squirrel species. So in Michigan and Wisconsin, northern flying squirrels are considered a species of special concern. In Pennsylvania, they're actually state endangered. They have state protection in West Virginia without, any sort of necessarily designated status. And then there is a species of northern flying squirrel that lives in the Appalachian Mountains that's federally protected. That subspecies has been getting pushed up elevation rather than farther north. And so this is something that's right at our doorstep, right? So we're just next door to Wisconsin and Michigan. So is this something we need to be worried about here? And I'll kind of come to that question in a second. But one thing that's important is that northern and southern flying squirrels are not identical in what they do in the ecosystem. If they were, you could make an argument that losing northerns but gaining southerns doesn't functionally matter. But they're different in a lot of ways. So southern flying squirrels, as I mentioned, are smaller, they're more aggressive. They do best in deciduous forest. They can't really use some of our subboreal, hemiboreal forest here in Minnesota. And there have been studies suggesting they consume more nuts and fruit, and they may be a carrier of intestinal parasite that's detrimental to flying squirrels and red squirrels. Northerns, again, larger, less aggressive coniferous forests, they consume more fungi. And so you might imagine if you lose northerns for southerns, you might not get quite as much dispersal of mycorrhizal fungi in some of those forests. And they may be negatively impacted by this nematode, this parasite. And where they share is that, they obviously have evolutionary history. So they're both gliding small squirrels, but they both use secondary cavities. So they don't create the cavities, other things like woodpeckers do, and then they use them. But they can both nest in the same cavities. And so that's a site where we might have some of this parasite spread. And so one of the questions that we're really interested in is, are there opportunities in Minnesota for coexistence, or is it a foregone conclusion that over time we will lose our northern flying squirrels and replace them with southerns? And we don't have an answer yet, but it's something that we think about and talk about a lot in my lab. I'm going to stop here because this is the point where sometimes when I give these public groups, people say, well, why should we care? They're flying squirrels, we're losing one, we're gaining one. Why should we care about them? And I would argue there's a few reasons why we should care. Number one, both species are native to Minnesota, at least in the recent past. They're a native part of our ecosystem. They play roles that are really important, like fungal and fruit seed dispersal. They're important prey species, all those things I talked about. The other reason we should care is that this change that's going on is not happening in isolation. So other components of our forests are changing, and it is really important that we understand those, even if you don't care about flying squirrels, because this change has implications for other aspects of our forests, right? And then finally, in my group, we're really interested in wildlife conservation management, understanding their ecology. And a big part of what we do is focus on habitat. And so we want to know what's going on here so that we can do our best to conserve habitat for these species and really balance how humans use forest with what different wildlife species need out of those forests too, so that we can make sure that while we're taking the resources we need, we're also providing for the species that call these forests home. So that's my pitch. Hopefully I've convinced you. If not, ask me about it at the end. They're also really cute. So they have a lot of intrinsic value to a lot of people that really enjoy seeing them. So as I mentioned, we're really interested in flying squirrels, evaluating their distribution, their ecology, and their interactions in Minnesota. And you can imagine there's a lot of different pieces that we need to put together to get the full view of what's happening. And so we're looking at least 6 different aspects right now. I'm going to give you a little bit of overview of what we're doing in this realm, but we do have some plans to look more in the genetics and diet. So the distribution, where each species live, their home ranges and their nest site selection to help us understand how they're interacting. And again, the parasite aspect to help us further understand how they might be interacting. So one of the critical questions that we have is, where does each species currently live? And we don't have a really good answer for this with flying squirrels. So this map is of occurrence data that was used in Evan Hazard's Mammals of Minnesota in 1982. They were occurrence records that were available at that time. So they give us somewhat of an idea that, we used to have northern flying squirrels in about the northern half of the state where there was forest. There's maybe a few southerns that were living in that area, but generally southerns were in the southern half as far as we knew. But where do they live now? It's kind of a hard question to ask because they're small and they're not hard to survey, but they take a lot of time and money to survey. So we could use a variety of different conventional methods. We could put a bunch of trail cameras out with suet cages or with peanut butter smeared on the tree. And if we can get the right measurements, we can figure out what species they are. But in a lot of cases, we won't know the species. So we'll know flying squirrels, but we won't get the information we want. We could go out and do a bunch of live trapping. When you have them in your hand, you can identify them. That could be a method, but that's really, really expensive. It can be stressful to the animals, so we don't want to do that unless we have to. Some folks have used nest boxes, so put up nest boxes, and then again, you can go in when they're being used, open them up, see who's inside, but we have the same sort of issues as we do with the trapping. It can be expensive. There can be some stress involved. More recently, folks who have been studying the Carolina northern flying squirrel, the endangered subspecies, have identified acoustic monitoring as a really strong method. So like bats, flying squirrels vocalize in the ultrasonic range. That's above what we can hear. They also do make vocalizations that we can hear. And so this paper by Gilly et al. Took flying squirrels in captivity, measured sonograms, and were able to distinguish certain call types that were distinct between the two species. And so another method would be to go out, put out these acoustic detectors like the ones that you might use for bats, and then bring them back to the office and identify the calls. And so this is a lot more cost effective than a lot of the other methods we're talking about. Similarly cost effective to trail cameras, except we have a lot better opportunity to identify them to species. So this is what we've been doing. I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but this just shows a trill call that we've gotten in some of our research. A northern flying squirrel on the left, a southern on the right. And so the northern is a lot more rapid, a lot quicker, whereas the southern has these sort of longer, slower trill call. So these are, visually you can see a difference, and we have software that can help us pull this out. So we're interested in going back to this coverage of acoustic data that was collected for a bat survey. You can see on the left side, pretty broad spatial coverage. We're working with some other partners like DNR Non-Game, and we'll be reaching out to folks at Forest Service and other places that have data to try to build as much acoustic data into this as we can. And then we did also in Cass County last summer and spring, we put out 105 acoustic detectors in an area that we knew we had both species to help us learn what factors influence where we have one, the other, or both species. So still in progress. I don't have anything to report on results yet, but within the next 6 months, we'll have some good results here. And now moving on to the second set, so the home range and nest site stuff. One of the things we really want to know, because it will inform on whether these species can coexist or whether we're getting competitive exclusion, is how they're interacting on the landscape. And so we could consider the home range, so sort of the part of the landscape that one squirrel uses for all of its activities, or the nest site scale. So these are just two different scales where they might be interacting. So when they're inactive during the day, they use nests. A lot of those are in tree cavities, but they also will use squirrel leaf nests or other external nests. In the winter, sometimes northern flying squirrels will actually rest underground in burrows. So going to the nest and seeing where are they. And for northern flying squirrels, how does the presence or absence of southerns affect where they're nesting or where their home range is? And so this is not that complicated of a figure, but it'll take me a little bit to walk through this. You can imagine from complete coexistence, which is the top row, down to complete competitive exclusion, which is the bottom row, and then, some sort of coexistence and exclusion, the middle two. We might see different things. So if they're completely coexisting, we might see at the landscape scale, there's a lot of overlap in species. At the home range scale, they overlap a lot, and they're using the same nest trees or the same types of nest trees. If there's complete exclusion, we might see total lack of overlap at all of these three scales. Whereas we might see some things in between where we have overlap at the landscape scale, but maybe they're not overlapping at the home range scale, but they are at the nest site scale, or they're not really overlapping at either of these scales, right? So, and it could be a process where as southerns first move in, we have a lot of overlap, but the longer they're there, it moves towards the bottom here. And so this this figure here sort of shows from the distribution data, the home range data, the nest site data, we can have a pretty good idea of where we're at in the zone that they currently overlap. So how we're doing the home range and nest site stuff is we're going out, we're setting traps, we're checking the traps and hoping to see little squirrel buddies in them like this. When we get them in a trap, again, we have a squirrel in a Ziploc bag here. We're taking some general measurements, being very quick. And finally, putting on an ear tag and a collar, a radio collar, collecting scat and hair samples, and then letting them go and seeing where they go. So this is a fun video. I'm going to orient you now. There's a flying squirrel that you're going to see moving up here, and then it's going to take off. It's not often the case that you get an opportunity to see a flying squirrel glide, so I wanted to make sure everyone got the opportunity to see that. So you can see there's the flying squirrel moving up, and then it's going to jump and glide. And I'm going to play it one more time, and what I want you to pay attention to is when it jumps, there's a little bit of a pause between when it jumps and when it throws out its arms and legs and extends that membrane to glide. So take a look at this again. And then you can see it also kind of turns as it goes. It always impresses me because it sounds like it would hurt when they hit the ground, but they just scamper away. Sometimes they land on trees. Okay, so once we have the collars on, then we can go and check on them and see what they're up to. And so part of this is identifying nest sites. So we go out during the day when they're inactive and track that radio signal down to find where they're at. So what stand are they in? What specific nest are they in? And then, again, we can have measurements like how high off the ground is it? What type? Is it a cavity? Is it another external nest? What direction does it face? We could also look at, what's the tree species? Is it living or dead? What size is it? Or things at the site, like what forest type is it? Is it upland or lowland? Is there snow? So we can see how snow affects where they're nesting. And this shows grad student Katie Pfaff, who's studying this for her master's degree. And this is just one of our nest trees. You can see some holes here, and that's one of the nests that we've identified. It's a lot of fun. It's kind of like a scavenger hunt or hide and seek. And this is something that I just really love once you get the collars on the animals, is seeing in their environment where they're going and what they're doing. Those observations that you're making are just really helpful to understand what they need and where they go. So our study areas, we're focusing this area around the greater Duluth area. And the reason for that is that we know we have both species here. Through this part of the project, we've trapped about 41 flying squirrels that we've collared. And what you can see is it's kind of complex. So some areas like Boulder Lake, Lester Park in Duluth, the Cloquet Forestry Center, we've only detected northern flying squirrels. Other areas like Hartley and Bagley in Duluth, we've only detected southern flying squirrels, and we have a handful of sites where we've detected both. And so with that sort of distribution, that survey that I talked about that we did, and with some of these data, we can help learn what features allow both to be there and what features seem to be associated with where we only have one. But we don't have an answer to that question yet. The other thing that I'm not going to mention is to get our home ranges, we're also going out at night and tracking them when they're active. And so we have a few people go out and we triangulate where they're at. So that way we can see outside of nests, where are they going and foraging at night? And that helps us to estimate where their home range is and how big it is and whether we have northern and southern flying squirrels that overlap. I do want to note that at the Fond du Lac Tribal Community College, they're a partner, been really fun to work with them. That's a site where we've collared both species, and we have had individual days where both species have been sharing the same nest at the same time. So that's interesting to see. Okay, so I'm just going to end quickly before we get to Q&A, talking just really briefly about this parasite-mediated competition. The parasite of interest here is called Strongyloides robustus, but it's not a very easy term to remember and say. But what parasite-mediated competition is when you have two closely related species that can both be infected by a parasite, but the effects that the parasite or other disease has, or the pathogen, I should say, has, is unequal. And so in this case, the concern is that southern flying squirrels carry this. It doesn't really affect them, but they can give it to northerns and it can make it so that they are more likely to die. And so to look at this, we're collecting fecal samples. So we're collecting scats. And then a grad student at Grand Valley State University in Michigan, Anthony Rayona, is working on that and identifying parasites. And so we've identified at least 5 different types of parasites, including strongyloides and one of interest. And I don't have time to really go into this in depth, but the good news right now is that at least in the greater Duluth area, we have a very, very low prevalence of strongyloides. And so at this time, it doesn't seem likely that that's going to usher northerns farther north. But that might change in the future. So in Ontario, for example, in the early 2000s, they looked at parasite presence and there's flying squirrels and they found really low rates of incidence. 10 to 15 years later, they found a lot of prevalence of it. So that's something that we need to pay attention to over time. Just because it's not here now doesn't mean it's not going to be an issue in the future. So with that, I hope that you enjoyed the talk. I just want to acknowledge that I'm here talking, but this is a big group effort. So some folks in my lab, field technicians who help collect the work, and then some wonderful partners. I will just name again Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College, who's been a fantastic partner, Grand Valley State University. And then this project is funded by the Environmental and Natural Resource Trust Fund as recommended by LCCMR. And we really, really appreciate their funding support for projects like this. So I know we have time, so I'd gladly take any questions we have.
Fantastic job, Michael. Thank you so much for sharing all the research and knowledge on these kind of amazing little critters. So, and yeah, thanks for all your sharing your partners too, because it takes a village to do some of this work, good work that we need to do. So, lots of questions coming in. So if you have questions, put them in there. If we can't get to them all, feel free to reach out to me or Michael, and we'll see if we can get those answered for you at a later date. But Liz had a question. She thought only southern squirrels glowed under the UV light.
No, all 3 species in North America do.
Okay.
Yep.
Catherine's wondering, does the fossil record show any evolutionary steps where the evolutionary development or divergence from other squirrels?
So that was 10 to 18 million years ago, if I'm not misremembering the dates. It's hard we study a lot of species. It's hard for me to keep all of that relevant. So there are some fossil species as well. And it's not an area that I'm very knowledgeable about. But presumably they all originated somewhere in Asia, came over at some point, likely through the Bering Land Bridge, spread throughout the continent, and then were isolated by later glaciation events. This is the same with like American martens and Pacific martens have been similarly isolated. So I can't give you more details than that other than to say there are fossil species that I don't know the names of or where they are or what periods they're from. But really good question. I wish I could answer it more completely.
Right. And another thing to reach into, right? We had several questions on this. So, Brad and Catherine, Richard all asked about interbreeding between northern and southern squirrels. Do they interbreed? If they do, are they sterile? What would you get if they did interbreed? What type of squirrel would you get? You have any comment on that?
Yeah, maybe you'd get Rocky the flying squirrel. No, so they do interbreed. They can interbreed. This has been shown in Ontario, which to my knowledge is the only place that's actually looked at this genetically. But we don't really know what that means. So it does not appear that the hybrids are sterile, so they could breed. But we don't know, for example, with the parasite effects, we don't know if those hybrids are intermediate, if they're more like northerns, more like southerns. There's a lot of information on that we're still lacking. I believe some folks in Ontario are looking further into that. Right now, what we're doing is just trying to collect samples so that at a future point, we can look at where and whether hybridization is going on. Because again, it's one of these things that to have it happening may not matter, but the only way we know that is A, knowing if it's happening, and then B, knowing over time how things change. If the hybrids are, for example, better adapted, are they going to swamp out northerns and, create another, group? Species is maybe strong, but another with southerns that will compete northern. So we don't know any of that now other than that it can happen. Is it happening? It probably is, just because, like I mentioned with our radio collar data, we do have areas where the two species are in very close approximation and even using cavities together. So it very likely could be happening, but we don't know yet.
Great. W had a couple of questions. Aside from our own efforts on combating climate change, is there something that we can do to help support flying squirrels, especially in Wisconsin? He must be from the home state here. And also nesting boxes. Would that be one way that people can help flying squirrels out?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first piece and get to nest boxes in a second. Right now, we don't really know. I mean, if this is mostly driven by climate, there's not a lot we can do other than obviously reducing carbon emissions and things like that. So we don't know right now. There may be management opportunities. We're still looking into that. So like in Wisconsin, I'm not super familiar with the situation there, other than to know there are a few places with northerns where northerns used to exist that they seem not to now. Um, Really, to answer that question, I think we need more complete information on where they live and how that changes over time. What we're hoping, and we don't have the answer yet, is that at least in Minnesota, we may be able to keep both for longer, because some of the lowland conifer forests that dominate the Arrowhead region and even over to the Red Lake peatlands and over there are really not suitable for southern. So until those change in species composition, forest species composition, they probably will be places that northerns can maintain occupancy. So not a lot of strong answers right now. In terms of the nest box situation, I don't know what to say on that, because where we have seen them, they're in forests where they seem to have a lot of different opportunities for cavities, but they're only using a small number of what we see while we're walking through. So it may help. It's always fun as a public engagement thing. But the trade-off is, if you have an area that might be good habitat but lacks cavities and you put nest boxes, is that going to function well, or is that going to be what we call an ecological trap, where you're moving them into an area that they're not going to do well even if there are cavities? So that's really not an answer. It's sort of cycling through some thoughts, but when we get to the end of this project, we should have more tools that land managers and others can use to monitor squirrel distribution and habitat going forward. And so if you ask me that in 2 years, hopefully I'll have a better answer. So I'll just cop out right now.
Great. And you can stop your presentation if you want, Michael.
Oh yeah, sure.
Um, Adrian is wondering, I've never thought about this, but can you speak to winter foraging habits? How likely is it that we see their tracks on fallen logs or in the snow as they're foraging for lichen or berries?
Yeah, so they do forage a bit on the ground. We see that especially for truffles and berries, obviously in the summer and the fall. They do, even when they're mostly aerially foraging, because they glide, they can't sustain altitude. And so they will sort of move towards at least the lower part of trees and then climb trees and glide again. And so, yeah, you could see their tracks. They do make tracks in the snow. Um, I'm not sure that I've ever specifically gone and identified that, but they would probably look similar to somewhere between a chipmunk and a red squirrel sized track. Um, yeah, but well, in terms of foraging strategy, when it's cold, they're not out as much, so they spend less time active. That's why they cache food when food's available. But they also tend to sort of restrict. And one thing that we're looking at that I didn't talk about is how during the winter, how they might change their activity patterns. So they're not out like tonight. The temperatures and the wind that we have forecasted in the -30 wind chill in parts of the state, not going to be a good night for flying squirrel to get out and be active.
A good night for a lot of things to be out and active.
Yeah, that's true.
We have a bunch of questions on talking about the collars.
Mhm.
Does the collars affect their gliding distance? How long do the batteries last? Do they fall off after a while? You want to touch on those a little bit?
Yeah, so what I will say is they might only last a day because they go into a nest and one of their friends or nest mates choose the collar or the antenna off. So we've had that happen. We've also had where we've recaptured them and they're not wearing a collar after only a few days. In general, when everything goes well, the collars will last for sort of 6 months up to, we've had one that was on the squirrel for a year. It lasted about, I think, 9 months. We just removed it a week or two ago because we retrapped the individual and we thought that he had already done his part for a project. So we didn't put another one on. So they can last indefinitely. They are really good at getting them off. I'd say probably 70 to 90% of them are off before the battery's dead. Unfortunately, flying squirrels being prey, sometimes they get killed by predators while they're wearing the collar. Does it cause an effect? The answer is whenever we collar animals, we do everything we can, regardless of species, to make it as safe and as minimal impact as we can. So we have things like a maximum body for a body size. What's a maximum weight of a collar a squirrel could hold? And we never will go that. We would prefer to go much under that. And if it's close, sometimes we elect not to collar just to be cautious. So we're doing everything that we can, but I wouldn't want to have a collar on me. It would probably at least irritate me. Would it change my ability to live my life? Probably not. So that is a consideration that we make. And when we can address our objectives without collaring, that's what we do. So I hope that answers all the questions. I don't have firm data on how it affects their gliding, whether it does, other than to say we've had individuals survive a long time, cross open roads numerous times. So whatever impact it is, it's not an immediate harsh impact that's going to cause them to die really quickly.
Interesting.
We really always want to minimize what impacts we have.
Yeah. Lisa had a great question here. How far from their nesting locations do they travel? She has one that shows up on a camera on the side of their house, and she's wondering if they live close by or how far they travel from where they're nesting.
Yeah, it's really hard to get great information on that because you have to be out a lot throughout the entire night tracking them, and then you also need to be out during the day, and so it really stresses a field crew. What I'll say is that, and I should have checked our home range estimates. I don't have those with me. They can move hundreds of meters. We don't have full knowledge of everywhere they go. I wish we did so that we could actually answer that question specifically. But if you have a flying squirrel that's frequently visiting, my guess is it has nests within a few hundred meters. But we have seen some really long movements too, quarter mile or a little more. So somewhere in that range would be my guess. And I know a lot of people up here in Duluth that really love seeing them when they come into feeders and stuff. They're really fun to watch.
Jeffrey up in your neck of the woods there in Knife River said he has 3 of them. He thinks they're northerns that show up his bird feeder frequently. He'd love to know where their nests are. Would you guys, people have them at their house? Is that something you guys could come in and collar and use in your studies? Or
we right now, I mean, in this region, we would consider that, except that we are done radio collaring them for this initial project. Otherwise, I'd say reach out. We'll see if it makes sense to do it. But again, yeah, we don't have the staff, the time, the money to. Those are questions I'd be really interested into. We just can't add it on right now, unfortunately. I'm always game for observations if people have them. If people have flying squirrels and are interested in trying to figure out what species, I'd be more than happy to correspond on how to set up a suet cage and a camera if you have one, or if you're local, we could get an acoustic detector out this spring or something. So if people are interested in that side of it, please reach out.
Yeah, great. And we can, if they missed your information, you can see it in the recording, or shoot me an email from our website, and I can connect you with Michael too. So Carol was wondering, what type of tree species are typically used for nesting? Is it a wide variety or specific tree species?
Yeah, and I cut that because I didn't want to go through too much detail on the research side of things. I always tend to go that direction, and I was trying to keep it light. But thanks for asking so that we can still address it. So what we've seen is that, and this is what other studies similar to this have found, southern flying squirrels really like deciduous trees. In this neck of the woods, that's aspen, but also maple and oak. They don't really use conifers. They also don't really use external nests. They almost exclusively use cavities. Northerns, on the other hand, can use basically anything. We see them more in conifers. We've seen them in balsam fir, those are usually external nests. We've seen them in pines, also aspen, oak, maple. So there's a little bit of overlap, but deciduous for southerns and deciduous or conifer for northerns.
Great. Ethan was asking, is there a comparable estimate of population density between flying squirrels, red squirrels, and gray squirrels? And how do they interact?
There probably are in some places. We don't have that data here. One thing that's really interesting is we actually finished a Fisher den box project a few years ago, so putting out den boxes for fishers. And we see a lot of our boxes get used by every species of squirrel that's in the area. So there can be a lot of overlap, as I talked about with the partitioning at the beginning. So chipmunks, red squirrels, gray squirrels are active during the day. Flying squirrels are active at night. There's some overlap in what they eat, but red squirrels and chipmunks will eat some fungi. They all eat nuts and berries and different types of insects. But it does seem, and I'm not really sure of the exact mechanism, but it does seem like there can be a lot of coexistence between the different tree squirrels.
Great. Mary was wondering, how long do the adult flying squirrels stay with their young?
That is a really good question. So I think it's about 5 weeks after birth until they take their first glides, but they're not really territorial, and there's not good data on dispersal to really answer that question. But we certainly see young, like they'll be in communal nests in the winter. I should say there's not data I'm available on dispersal. So whether they just sort of hang out, shift to a nearby area over time, totally disperse, probably all of that happens, but I don't know exactly when, if they're moving away from home, when that would be.
Okay. There's one about bluebird boxes in here. Christine came across a group of flying squirrels late in the fall huddled in a bluebird box. Is that typical behavior for winter, or do they do that year round?
They huddle year round to a degree. When the females have young, they tend not to want other flying squirrels around in those sites, in those nests. And so there will be a period where they sort of exclude other squirrels, but they do huddle whenever it's beneficial to them. Not so much in the summer because they don't need to temperature wise, but even late summer into falls, we start getting, cooler nights, cooler mornings and evenings. They huddle to stay warm. And in the bluebird boxes, I would not expect them to use those in really cold months like now because there's not enough insulation. So last winter, whenever we had our really cold days, some of our areas, all the squirrels were always in the same tree, and it was the biggest tree that we had. But the huddling, yeah, they do that quite a bit, and they can get pretty large and sometimes mixed species groups.
All right, we are quickly running out of time here, so I know there's a few questions I didn't get to, and I apologize for that, but hopefully we got to most of them. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. We might have to have you back after your research wraps up and see what you did find out after all this. There's a lot of interest in flying squirrels around Minnesota, so.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And thanks everybody for joining us. I'm glad you found us here on the first webinar of our winter series. Next week on the 18th, we have a webinar number 193 coming up on just outdoor activities to do with kids and families. Wintertime is a cherished time for some people in Minnesota, and it's a good time to get outside, and kids are out of school and just enjoy the outdoors. So Pete Cleary from Dodge Nature Center is going to join us to talk about fun activities you can do with your kids outside. So as every other week, get outside, enjoy the great outdoors, have fun and be safe out there, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.